registered after as well. All right.
Great.
So hello, everyone. Welcome. Happy Thursday. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for taking the time to gather for what promises to be a very enlightening and informative event. Again, if you're just signing on, feel free to drop a comment in the chat box. Let us know where you're coming in from. So this is one of many regular events through our new community and integration platform, the Maloka, where we offer workshops, talks, sharing circles, and more from practitioners, teachers, and luminaries across many different fields of holistic health. So this evening, I'm so pleased to introduce Dr. Omid Naim as our event host. I first met Dr. Naim at Soltara when he came through as a guest. And in connecting with him afterwards, I was just so inspired by his approach to healing because it was everything that I wanted to see in the field of modern medicine. It is an integrative approach that orients the individual to the collective, utilizes an ecological lens, as well as a holistic healing model where pharmaceuticals aren't necessarily the immediate first response. So Dr. Naim is an integrative psychiatrist and founder of Hope Psychiatry, a clinic which employs a multimodal and holistic approach to healing and recovery. He was born in Tehran, Iran, just before the Iranian Revolution in 1978. This early childhood experience of societal terror and chaos shaped his appreciation for how unresolved trauma and grief have lifelong effects on individuals, families, and the community. So through the lens of his own family, Omid came to witness firsthand how unacknowledged trauma can be neglected as the root cause of emotional illness and other chronic health conditions in our society. After completing medical school at the University of Southern California and residency training in general adult and child psychiatry at USC, Dr. Naim began working in community mental health with high-risk youth. Even though he was a classically trained Western psychiatrist, Omid could see that there was a need for a more holistic, spiritual, and community-based approach to health due to the limitations of the medical model. This fueled his passion to find new ways to approach how we care for people and led him to further his education in integrative medicine at the University of Arizona. So Hope Psychiatry focuses on the self-empowerment of the individual to achieve complete recovery from chronic illness by supporting our innate drive for wholeness, healing, and self-actualization. Through the power of storytelling based on modern neuroscience, we can tie together our past, present, and future based on our deep needs. Oops. Oh, I lost my spot here. Hold on one second. Deep needs for meaning and belonging to understand how disconnection is the root of most chronic illnesses. With this lens, he founded a nonprofit called the Lameda Project, whose mission is to rewrite the story of mental health and well-being through a trauma-informed and ecological lens, to understand human health and address the root causes of chronic illness in the West, namely disconnection from our bodies, belonging, nature, and spirit. So his talk today focuses on how, in the midst of a psychedelic revolution, we have an opportunity to reimagine our healthcare models and sciences as providers to tell a more accurate, meaningful, and inspiring story of trauma, human nature, and what it means to truly heal and become whole. So we'll have a little bit of time for questions at the end, as I mentioned. So if you do have any questions, please go ahead and utilize the Q&A chat box at the bottom. Thank you so much, Dr. Naim, for being here today, and I'll let you take it away.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. So glad to help you launch the Maloka, and appreciate the invitation to give my talk to your community, and to hopefully see it grow and grow as a movement around particular values. And that's a part of what I'm going to talk about today, the importance of values. So the title of the talk, Psychedelics, How Can They Truly Transform Society's Well-Being? In the course of my work with individuals and clients, I've come to believe and work with people that their individual path towards wholeness is part of us becoming conscious of our responsibility and our relationship with our community, our relationship with others, the earth, and that's really what I hope this talk inspires you all to see, this idea of an ecological lens, that we We exist in a web of relationships. So my first slide, I always start with this, the statistics on how we are doing currently in mental health in the United States. As you can see, the disability rates since the 1950s. In the 1950s, 1 out of 500 people had to file for disability because of mental illness. By the 1980s, it was 1 out of 200. And for my last read in 2013, it's 1 out of 76. As you can see with like use of medication in children, 1 out of 4 adolescents having an anxiety disorder, 1 out of 5 college entering class individuals on a medication. We are, the story I'm trying to tell here is that, the 1950s and 1980s are actually really relevant decades, because the 1950s are when psychiatric medication first really started to boom. And they were said to be, wonder drugs. In the 1980s was the beginning of what's called the biological revolution in psychiatry. Like people have heard of the book Prozac Nation, the modern SSRIs and modern psychiatric medications in the 1980s and 90s really were thought to be the solution. And yet what you see is that we actually are sicker over time. The data on the right, 1 out of 6 adults using psychiatric drugs, yet we are more disabled than we've ever been. We consume 80% of the world's opiates. And I think that there's a real direct line between a society whose value system is so primarily oriented towards the individual and the liberty of the individual and self-reliance. However, what our healthcare says is actually that we're breeding dependency. And so how can that be? And this was really the world I kind of entered into. As a resident, what I was taught was the best we could do was to help people become stable, to be stable on medication. By the time I was in residency in the early 2000s, it was 20, 30 years into the biological psychiatry, and this idea of the chemical imbalance is accepted theory as to why why people develop depression and anxiety, and patients come in talking about having a chemical imbalance, and it's become accepted in our culture. And these are accepted now as chronic conditions. The other thing that I experienced as a resident was a real lack of coherence between models. So what I mean by that is, I would go in the morning, I might be in a medication management clinic where I'm learning that chemical imbalances are the cause of depression, anxiety that we're seeing. And then I would go to a psychodynamic supervision group and I would learn psychodynamic theories. Then I'd go to a CBT class and learn about cognitive behavior models. And I found that to be really disappointing. It felt to me like, if you had a heart condition, what would it be like if you're the nurse, the cardiologist, the technician who does your x-rays, they all tell you different stories as to why you're sick, why this sickness developed. The other thing that's really specific to Western medicine is that it's a pathogenic model. Our studies of disease are based on studying sick people and seeing sick people as a separate group. And I'm going to get to that in a few more slides about a different approach called cytogenesis. Lastly, that there's no preventative models. And what I describe this all together to be is a very reductionistic approach. So the illness is reduced, what people experience as mental health is reduced to disease. The disease is reduced to the individual. And we reduce it to these separate things. It's a problem with thoughts. It's a problem with your neurotransmitter levels. We're not seeing things in the context of relationships. And ultimately, we're telling people that you are the problem, that there's a problem inside you, and there's something wrong that needs to be fixed with an outside agent. So in terms of the psychedelic revolution, psychedelics really changed my life. I was just last night talking about 2007, taking psychedelics for the first time, and 6 months later, I was divorcing my first wife and realizing that we got into it for the wrong reasons. It really changed my life. However, I also experienced the psychedelic community to be excited about this revolution without really understanding that this is not the first time we have thought that we have the elixir, that we have what's going to solve it. And we're, I think, coming at it very often through that same mindset of reductionistic thinking and fixing people. In the late 1800s, Freud began this path of psychoanalysis, and we told people that parents and society is what's making you sick, but we also were reducing the human being and human nature to being driven just by dark and selfish drives. And the solution was this top-down solution, empowering the ego, actually. In the 1950s, the behavioral revolution, again, it's top-down control models, reducing things just to behaviorism. And again, like further communicating into the culture what it is to be human is just like this idea of like a machine, that we're just these machines to upregulate and downregulate behavior. But again, in the 1950s, the behaviorists thought that they had the solution to all our problems. And again, in the 1980s, the biologic and genetic revolution. And what I mean by revolution is that we had technology that could look at brain function, look at blood flow, and develop, and that's what led to these theories like the chemical imbalance theory. And my hope is the psychedelic revolution can be different because they open us to, most often the experience is the awareness of the interconnected nature of reality, and most often experiencing love and these themes of transcendence. And if we can tell a story that can orient people's path, I think that we can really see this be different. So in my clinic, the Hope Integrative Psychiatry, we practice what's called trauma-informed integrative care. And our core beliefs are is that we have an epidemic of mental illness, addiction, and other chronic health conditions, which we have the ability to naturally and completely recover. If you look at science and research and quotes from people from the American Psychiatric Institution, National Institute of Mental Health, prior to the 1980s, depression, anxiety were considered to be acute episodic conditions that most people recovered from completely. Like a broken bone or a broken skin wound, we have the ability to completely recover. And so this myth of chronic illness is that it's a myth. Number two, that the root cause is primarily unresolved trauma and grief that we hold in our bodies and that we are expressing in our lifestyles. Number three, trauma and grief are our heritage. Trauma is not the problem. We have an innate capacity to heal under proper conditions. We have evolved to actually experience far greater degrees of trauma and grief than we experience in modern life, actually. Transformation in community is how we have always healed and brought out the best in ourselves and each other. And that our field needs a new sacred cultural practice for healing in community. And sacred cultural practices, they empower a whole person transformational approach. So that's what we're going to go into today, is what that means. Just a list of the different lenses, modalities, and research that I've taken into account to try and develop our model. Especially integrative medicine, cytogenesis, which we're going to go into, as well as these other theories. We're going to go into all of them. Integrative medicine, just to pay homage to a mentor of mine, was founded by Andrew Weil. And it has a deep philosophical foundation around the mind-body connection, the role of spirituality, beliefs, culture, empowering individuals, and the centrality of community and the environment. So this was, Cytogenesis was a field that had a very big influence on me. Cytogenesis is the word itself means the study and creation of health. Okay, if anybody's gone to medical school, they've learned, the most important course is pathology. So what I was saying earlier, our entire field is based around the study of sickness. Cytogenesis is the study of health. It was actually founded by, he's an Israeli researcher in the 1960s and 70s, Aaron Antonovsky, who was asking a question: why is it that there are very different outcomes in Holocaust survivors? There are Holocaust survivors who have extremely high levels of chronic health conditions, more than the average population. But then there are also Holocaust survivors who have exceptional health and who thrive. And what he was posing was this question of, we need to study the healthy population. We need to study what is happening that determines these different outcomes. And he wanted to challenge two key axiomatic beliefs in medicine. The first is that disease is the norm. The disease is, what he posited is that the reality is that the disease is the norm and health is a triumph. And what does he mean by that? Is that we've come to accept in Western medicine and Western culture that health is our baseline state, that's the norm. And that when we develop some kind of a sickness, that's a betrayal of the norm. When in reality, the laws of physics tell you that actually everything is always falling apart, that breakdown and falling apart and entropy are actually the normal state. And what he was saying is that that the reality is to see that health is actually this unique force, this life force that keeps creating order, keeps bringing things together into relationship against the natural separation and drifting apart of matter and of the decay of our bodies. The second one is this idea that healthy and diseased people are separate populations, that there's people who have sickness and then there's people who are healthy, and that they're seen as separate populations, when in fact, health and disease are really on a spectrum, and that the human being, that any organism encounters stress moment to moment, and our ability to stay healthy is based on that capacity to heal, and that we're constantly staying healthy through this life force. And when that life force is overtaken by disease, by stress, that's when we start to see disease. And he wanted to really, his idea was that we need to be studying this force of health, the life force. So what he did is he actually did a lot of research on different populations and what he came to was that there was the key factor was, in the face of stress, when a person maintains a sense of coherence in which they feel they can stay whole, they have an optimal capacity to respond to that stress, to that challenge, to that trauma, to grief. And he found that there are three core factors that determine that sense of coherence in an individual. And it's when an individual believes that when something bad happens, it is ultimately comprehensible, manageable, and meaningful, which means that ultimately, number one, that there is a reason for what happened, that I may not understand it yet, but there is a reason if I try and understand it. Number two, that it is manageable, that I may not have the skills or the resources, but I can acquire those and I can solve my problems. And the third and most important was that my ability to overcome this challenge is deeply meaningful to me, that it matters that I change, that it matters that I transform, that it matters that I grow. And ultimately, what I extrapolated from this is that cytogenesis and this finding of the sense of coherence and these three factors are the key to individuals and communities that thrive under stress. Really, they represent the traditional art of storytelling. If you can imagine that most of human history, our main healthcare system was elders sitting around and telling stories that inspired us to face our challenges as best as possible. Telling stories, the key to the reason we tell stories to young people is to communicate to them that bad things do happen. You know, the hero's journey is that exact thing, that challenge is part of life, that there are skills and resources that we find if we go out into the wild, if we go out into the dark. And it places you as the individual in a meaningful narrative, in a meaningful story in which your ability to triumph, overcome, challenge is part of your personal life story of fulfillment. So moving on to understand what is really the root cause of our problem in mental health and the epidemic. If people have not heard of this, the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, it's a really landmark study that was first done in the late 1990s by Kaiser, studying over 17,000 people. It has been duplicated multiple times in all socioeconomic classes, a broad range of ethnicities and race. And it reliably has shown that early childhood adversity is the most strongly correlated, strongly causative risk factor for chronic health conditions. And what they did was they tracked, what they did was they studied, they looked across over 17,000 people at early childhood, and they assessed them for up to 10 different risk factors for trauma. That included neglect, abuse. It could include divorce in the family, mental illness in the family, addiction in the family. And what they found was that there was a direct correlation between early adversity and chronic health conditions, including depression, anxiety, as well as heart disease, lung disease, addiction, suicide. So what is trauma? A big influence on me was the somatic theory of trauma. Reading Peter Levine's book, Waking the Tiger, I read this towards the end of my residency, and I like to tell the story that it was the first time I had heard that stress and trauma and emotions were in the body. We learned such top-down models, and that was the beginning for me of appreciating the mind-body connection. And what Peter Levine talked about was that trauma is actually not a disease. It's a temporary state in which we are stuck, that we have a fight or flight response, but we also have a freeze state. That freeze state is it's called playing dead, this immobile state that the body can go into, where we freeze up. It actually is protective evolutionarily. There are many predators who do not eat something if it's dead. There are many predators who cannot see unless there's movement. And so there's a lot of theories as to why, but as far back as jellyfish, we actually have this mechanism of freezing in the face of threat. And for reasons of that humans have this mental capacity, we stay stuck, unable to complete that natural cycle where we eventually release when the threat is over. And that we naturally have this innate capacity to heal. And naturally in the wild, we have those conditions in which we release that stuck energy. Another big influence on me was this book, Desmond Morris's book, The Human Zoo. And this really began for me to really think about the story is the key. So what Desmond Morris was talking about was that it is unique to human beings to have mental illness, except for animals also in the zoo. And that in zoos, animals begin to show the same signs. And what he talked about was that human beings, we have two different natures. We have a cooperative and a competitive nature. And when we lived in tribes in which survival was an immediate threat day to day, cooperation and competition were actually one thing. That our ability to compete depended on our ability to cooperate. And our ability to cooperate was actually our competitive drive. It depended on that. And it's as we have grown in size that those parts of us have become imbalanced. So it's cooperation, it's community, it's belonging that you start to see maybe really what's underneath why we have become so sick. Sebastian Unger's book on homecoming and belonging is a really wonderful book that goes through the research that shows that we actually have lower rates of mental illness following large-scale disasters. New York City saw almost the 50% drop in mental health usage in the year following 9/11. And what he shows is that we really actually, in disaster, we actually come together. And it's in that coming together in which we reconnect with that natural state of belonging, in which brings out our innate resilience. And maybe the problem is not that we have trauma, but that because we no longer need each other, the trauma stays stuck inside the individual. So I believe that the story really is not even trauma. So our model is a trauma-informed approach, but the real problem is that we've lost the conditions in which we evolved to thrive in. The problem is really disconnection. And what we've seen is the changes in the way we're living since the late 1800s, when Freud began to try and describe hysterics, is a story of progressively becoming disconnected from the ecological conditions that we evolved to need to be whole. You know, in the late 1800s, the Industrial Revolution had really altered dramatically our day-to-day experience. We mostly were outside before that, and then now we were pulled into factories indoors and being indoors most of the time. And we mostly worked with family and intimate community. And it brought us into this mechanization of experience. 1950s, you saw a huge drive towards suburbanization and the breakdown of the extended family. This idea of the nuclear family being the norm is a very new concept. Most of the world still does not see the nuclear family as what it takes to raise a child. And I think what we should say is we're really experimenting the last 70, 80 years with this idea. In the 1980s, you saw even a further breakdown of the nuclear family, with divorce rates going so high and single parents raising kids. And I think that you can continue to see how the chemical imbalance theory and then the technological revolution, that these are all more and more phasing us out of direct felt experience. You know, for the first time in human history, a person can work to feed himself and house himself and herself without actually even needing to have a real relationship. 60, you know, in some studies right now in the US, they find that over 60% of people do not have a single person they can turn to in a time of need. So this progressive change is narrowing our experiences. And that is what is really diminishing our resilience. There is a large body of research called resilience research. So in terms of trauma research, there's also resilience research. Resilience is the ability to overcome trauma. And so there's a lot of research on what are the factors that are protective for people who've experienced trauma. If you look at them, time in nature, exercise, community, if you look at that alongside the epidemiological data on countries that have low rates of mental illness and low rates of trauma, it all actually points to this ecological theory, is that really these are the conditions that we evolved to live in. These are our natural conditions, as opposed to this very brief moment in time that we call modernity. So is the root cause disconnection from our bodies, from each other, from nature, and from meaningful values that lead us to not be able to complete our emotions? And the real root cause then is the stories we are telling about human nature and mental illness, because the way in which we are organizing, if you look at this chart, what's driving this form of what we call progress is theories on human nature, what it is that we need to be fulfilled. If our story of human nature is individualistic, is that individual fulfillment is what matters, that would explain why we would create technologies that don't mind separating us. So really, starting with the psychoanalytic revolution, we've been telling people that our parents and community is what's making us sick. And we're telling a story of human nature that is driven by dark and selfish values, right? And behaviorism is telling a story about human nature being mechanistic. And so there's just been this growing story of human beings as being helpless in the face of their genes, and disconnecting us from really what it is to be whole. And so, you know, there's a disease that I think is a very good analogy to what the story I'm trying to tell. It's called pica. Pica is a disease that happens when people experience extreme iron deficiency. When you experience extreme iron deficiency, the body goes into this drive that people will begin to behave erratically and bizarrely, including eating dirt and clay and eating like metal materials. And it looks like a psychological condition, but what it really is there's just an extreme level of iron deficiency, and the body is trying to get iron into its system as in whatever way it can. And so what we're talking about for human beings is this deep drive for intimacy, for real, deep, authentic connection. And that is what we really need to be whole. And that's that central drive of the human experience. And true intimacy is rhythmic, it's embodied, it's relational, and it's felt. And that need for true intimacy, those are the signals in which we complete our emotions. And so we know this really well. If you have that person in your life that you can be yourself with completely. If you're stressed, if you're overwhelmed, when you come in, you know, when you get home to that person or when you meet that person, what you experience is that your body relaxes. That ability to exhale, that's the stress response. That's our emotional circuitry finding completion when we experience authentic belonging. And it requires that we act in a deeply interdependent relationship. And so what's happening is that we have a culture that promotes values that are not whole. And that's breeding this unending search for completion. So you could look at like addiction and compulsive behaviors as outcomes of that. So what I'm arguing for is that medicine and mental health care develop what we call an ecological lens, which is not that different than saying what a holistic approach. But I like the idea of an ecological model because it really simplifies what that means. To me, an ecological model, an easy way of understanding that is that it's how we study health in all other species and organisms in the entire universe. So medicine for all other species is an ecological approach. When you get a house plant, you get a card that tells you how much water, how much sun, what kind of soil, how do you care for this organism? That's healthcare for all other organisms, but we have a very different approach for us. So for instance, I tell my patients, like, if you don't water a plant and the leaves turn brown, would you call it brown leaf disease? I think it's really important that we tell a story that's accurate and meaningful. So an ecological lens looks at the internal and the external dimensions, our physical needs, our emotional needs, our mental needs, our spiritual needs, and what that we get in the environment, and that all of these different systems are actually interdependent. And when all these parts are in flow, we are complete. And so wholeness, our natural conditions to be a part of something. And I think that we all know this very, very deeply through our own lived experience. If you've ever been a part of something in which you feel like you contribute and that you have to give it your all. And I put this picture up there because it is no different than what this pack of zebras is experiencing. And so how do this group stay in flow with each other? It is body to body in which they are sensing each other. They're not telling each other, let's all go to the right when the lion comes. It's through close, intimate awareness, body to body of each other. And the one that loses the pack, that's the one that gets eaten. And so our optimal state, our natural state, is to be in flow with our environment, in flow where these competitive and cooperative parts of us are in flow with each other. And that's the same experience as when we are authentic and experience a sense of belonging in relationships. And it's in that state in which we complete our emotions. So this ecological principle of wholeness can be a guide to really what it is to be human. Wholeness, what wholeness means is completion. That all parts are incomplete. And it can be broken down into two core drives. So when Freud talked about the human being having a sex drive and a death drive, what he was saying is that the core drives of human being are sex and advancing our genes. In ecological medicine and this principle of wholeness, it gets really at the basic level of all biological organisms have two core drives, and that's the same for the human being. We have a drive for self-correction and we have a drive for self-completion. Whether it's a single cell or it's this multi-organ being called the human being, our number one task is to stay intact through stress. An example of that is you go from, if you go into a hot tub or if you go into a cold bath, you stay at 98.7 degrees. Your body is constantly trying to keep you in balance. If I skin my knee, the wound heals. If I break my bone, that bone can heal. So our first drive is to stay intact. If there's enough energy left over, then we grow. Example of that is the acorn becoming the oak tree, that we have an innate design within us to fulfill. And I think that we experience that second drive as authenticity. When those moments in which we know we are actualizing our true gifts, our true self, in which we are being ourselves and we are on a path of fulfilling something. So this idea of authenticity and belonging, this is the core part of our heritage. We evolved as mammals to sense each other like that pack of zebras. There's a number called the Dunbar number. It's 150. And when anthropologists have studied human behavior, they found that until modern times, most communities, villages, maxed out at about 150 people. When people study now social media, they found that regardless of how many people, how many friends we can say we have on social media, that the most number of people that we can actually really know and truly know who they are is about 150 people. And it's thought to be that this is really what it's based on our circuitry's ability to actually intimately know somebody, and intimately knowing them, meaning that we can trust them, that we know their actions, we know their behaviors such that we can predict it well enough that we can rely on them. And so belonging is this sense in which we can be ourselves and express ourselves authentically. And we have to have a role. We have to be a part of, to be really a part of something, we have to have something to contribute. And that relationship, when our authentic self finds a community in which we can be ourselves and contribute, that's when we're in flow. Emotions are a mammalian adaptation in which we communicate with each other. And there's a morality to that, and there's a reciprocity to that. So what are the conditions that we need as human beings to be whole? As mammals, we require deeply intimate relationships to feel safe and secure. Emotions are information processing for coordinating behavior. They're not for personal consumption and misery, is what I say. Because in modern life, we mostly experience our emotions as our private experience for our own management, when really their purpose is to communicate. They're embodied, sadness, crying, anger, joy, all of these have physical expression. This is the 90% of communication, they say, that's nonverbal. Emotions are meant to communicate between us. They're not meant for us to experience for ourselves. And that's where it gets stuck inside us. And so fulfillment comes when we can experience that felt sense of being in flow in terms of our emotions and our circuitry. And we need to participate in struggle and community to receive the signals that express our innate resilience. So I'm going to go into a theory with you guys called bottom-up regulation to go deeper into understanding what wholeness is and how we experience it. So bottom-up regulation explains how the brain actually processes information. This is the triune model of the brain. In red, blue, and green, we're breaking down the entire brain into 3 sections. And while there is some overlap, evolutionarily, you can see this triune brain explains really our evolutionary history. That the human brain is a reptilian brain, the brainstem and spinal cord, with a mammalian brain on top, which is the limbic system, with the prefrontal cortex, the neocortex on top, which is thinking. So it's like a reptile with a mammal and then a human on top. That our fight or flight system originates in the brainstem. It's the most primitive part of our brain. The limbic system is the next in evolutionary line, and it's actually slower than the brainstem. And then the thinking part is actually the slowest. If anybody's ever had a car suddenly jump out in front of them and they slam on the brakes, your arm shoots out to protect your passenger. That arm shoots out, and then a moment later, we think my arm just shot out. If you're in a job interview or on a first date and you're nervous and you start to feel panicked in your body, no matter how much you tell yourself, calm down, it doesn't work, because thinking is actually the slowest in line. And so the circuitry goes bottom up in terms of information processing. So physical to emotional, then mental. In the brainstem, where fight or flight originates, it responds to daily rhythms. We evolved, starting the brainstem, starting in the mother's womb, is listening and hearing for the beating of the mom's heartbeat, or circadian rhythms, day and night, digestion. The brainstem's focus is on finding rhythms that it can assign itself to. So daily patterned experiences are actually the most beneficial for the part of our brain that regulates trauma. You can see why, for instance, yoga is said best to be done every day. So the limbic system, it thrives with deeply interdependent relationships. And then the prefrontal cortex, it thrives with narratives that are coherent, stories that bring coherence to our experiences. So how can we not be whole? How did things start to disconnect? So the beginning of the mind-body disconnect is when we began to have the ability to think. So when that neocortex, when the prefrontal cortex really came online, we call that the cognitive revolution. That's when we began to have representational information, when we can form ideas. That mental capacity, what that allowed us to do was to create webs of cooperation beyond emotional intimacy. So going back to this slide, the reptile in red is purely self-regulating. That's why reptiles are cold-blooded animals, and we describe human beings that only care about themselves to be cold-blooded. The innovation of a mammal is the ability to cooperate and to maximize survival by working together. And it's emotions that govern that. And that experience of being in a community, in relationships that are intimate, is dependent on that limbic circuitry where we actually feel connected to each other. What the cognitive revolution gave us was the ability to actually organize cooperation and coordination in larger groups, right? Like 1,000 people can show up in an army, or thousands of people can work in a corporation because we're able to coordinate through ideas. So with that, we gained the ability to control our emotions. And what that created was this opportunity for creativity, in which we can delay gratification towards future creation, but it also began the alienation from ourselves and the possibility of losing that ability for fulfillment, which can leave us disconnected and feeling empty. And so disconnection is the ability to disassociate from that direct experience of reality. And my belief is that this is what then spawned wisdom traditions. So whether it is Western wisdom traditions like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, or it's Buddhism, Taoism, that is when we began to tell stories to try and keep us whole. So the story of the Garden of Eden, being in paradise, if you can imagine that maybe the Garden of Eden, it represented this experience of being whole. And what the story tells is that when we ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which you can say is with cognition, you can assign judgments. And what the story said was that when God said, now that you've eaten from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you will rule the earth, but it would also be the cause of your greatest suffering. So that ability to expand and overtake animals that were larger than us depended on this cognitive ability to organize in larger and larger groups. However, it also created this alienation. The serenity prayer is saying the same thing. To know what can I control and what I cannot, to have the wisdom to know the difference. It's this ability to use this creative capacity properly. Buddhism's main idea of non-attachment, that the illusion that our judgments create and that attachment to our ideas are what cause our suffering. To me, this is the same story as leaving paradise in the Garden of Eden. And so so I think that bottom-up regulation is telling the story that all wisdom traditions are trying to tell us. And it's what Cytogenesis came to also, this sense of coherence when our mind, when our stories are in line with our emotional experiences and what our body is telling us. When we experience that coherence, we stay whole through stress. And wisdom traditions across the world, as well as integrative practices, began to spawn all over in all civilizations, different practices, these integrative practices, whether it's sports or it's yoga, tai chi, or it's dancing, music. All of these things are practices to help us stay integrated, to help us stay whole, to bring the mind and the body in flow and to keep us whole. And this to me is the story of human nature. And so I believe that what bottom-up regulation is showing is, and I put this alongside, it's the same story as what Maslow's hierarchy is telling, that we start with our basic physical regulation, and then we're able to experience through real authenticity, belonging, and then self-actualization, that science, and the argument is that science needs to and can become a wisdom tradition in which it's telling a story of human nature that's accurate and keeping us whole. And what I call this is the circuit of health and meaning. And that, so in the red, when our brainstem is being supported by the daily rhythmic practices that we evolved to thrive in, when our limbic system is being supported, when we support ourselves with the kinds of relationships that are authentic and real and include true interdependence, and when our culture and stories that in our personal stories and our cultural stories are coherent with who we really are, then over here to the right, we can work with true intrinsic values. And when we sync up with others through authentic values, that's when we sync up and our emotional circuitry gets to complete and our stress response gets to complete. And this is what optimal health looks like, but it's also what optimal states of meaning. And I think that that we've all felt this is like those moments in which we say, if I died today, if I died tomorrow, it would be okay. In the face of humans' greatest fear, which is death, we actually have moments in which when we are in flow, we feel like we could die. And that says something about what really is the core drive of human beings, is this self-actualization of wholeness. And this core conflict then happens in modern life. Authenticity is what we come into the world naturally as. The baby does not hide what it's feeling. It doesn't hold in and it doesn't hold back. And we know this feeling. So why does it change? Is because as mammals, and this is something I learned from Gabor Mate, is this conflict between authenticity and attachment, that in early life, attachment will always win out for the mammal because we can't survive on our own. And fitting in takes on a life or death quality. And so ideas of who we need to be get trump our authenticity. And we literally pretend in order to fit in. And this is what leads to the persona. And so this is a depiction of what I call the primary disconnect. And so when you look at individuals who go through traumatic experiences, and why do some move through and thrive, but others develop chronic health conditions, why do we stay stuck in that frozen state? It's the people who already had to disconnect from their authentic self in some way. And the persona is made up of beliefs as well as holding in the body. So we learn to hold inside who we really are. And that's why acute episodic conditions like grief and stress become chronic. And over time, a body that was not designed for chronic stress, were designed for acute states of stress, that's what leads to the stress and inflammation that eventually leads to the physiology of depression, anxiety, and PTSD. And then ultimately, lifestyle. So this is the same basic depiction with the persona and core beliefs holding in the body, leading to chronic states of inflammation. And then we need lifestyle choices to balance that out, because while the persona is holding together the image of being okay in some way, we need things to regulate what we're feeling inside. And this is really the source of a lot of addictions and compulsive behaviors, which does not just mean substance abuse. It can be workaholism and so many things, status addiction. And then I also put out here conventional medication, because they're a way to control symptoms. And so for us at Hope, what we always tell people is that most often the crisis that brings you in is actually your health emerging. That a crisis occurs, so this is a stable state. This is what I learned, what stable means. The best we can do is to stabilize people's symptoms. But then something in life will happen that disrupts that cracks happen. And it can either be a positive or negative event. But when the persona breaks down, the symptoms leak out. And that's when we have to change. And it's actually the signals of our innate wholeness and authentic self breaking through. And a crisis is actually critical. You know, it's the call to action that helps you know that there's a way that you are out of balance. It's the death of our inauthentic persona parts. It also brings you back into relationship in your body, realizing that you need others. And I think that this is the source of why we call suffering as grace, is because it's crisis that brings us back into wholeness. I think that the way to look at psychedelics is that they actually evoke a crisis. So I think that all interventions that we provide people can be categorized as three: either suppressing a symptom, either suppressing the authentic self, either supporting the authentic self. Also, there are things that evoke the authentic self. And so I put psychedelics alongside many, many other things that evoke that breakdown of the default mode network that we don't have time to go into. So last couple slides. Rick Strassman's books have had a big influence on me. And what Rick Strassmann, he wrote DMT, the Spirit Molecule. And then he wrote a book, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy. And these books were, I think, a couple decades separated from each other. And what he wrote about in the second book was that that when he did his research with ayahuasca in the 1980s, he was studying to see if people had a mystical experience, if they had a spiritual experience, and relating that to health benefits. And what he came to see over the last couple decades is that there was a bias there, that psychedelics, they came into our culture in the 1950s at the same time as Eastern wisdom traditions like Buddhism and Taoism. And Buddhism's idea of nirvana, and oneness as a spiritual experience is actually only one kind of spiritual experience or contact with the divine. There's also a relational approach, and that's Western tradition, the prophetic tradition. So, compare, for instance, the Buddha's message of self-actualization, the experience of nirvana is this experience of oneness, versus Moses or Jesus's experience with the divine is a relational one, in which we are given messages, we are given stories that put us in a call to action and give us a role that we have to perform, that we are being guided to perform. And so these two different experiences, what he was saying was he went back and looked at the data that he collected on the ayahuasca experiences. And what he found was that he was missing so much important information because many people were getting prophetic messages. And he was arguing that the psychedelic experience is better seen as a prophetic one. Because in a prophecy, we are given a task. We are given information about a role we are to play in our community, in our society. And you can see how that maps also to the hero's journey. Joseph Campbell's idea that all myths, the main myth is this hero's journey in which there is a call to action, there's a crisis. And the hero, the individual must go out and leave the community to find out what he or she's gift is, slay a dragon, but then you come back to your community with a message and with a purpose to fulfill a duty. And so this idea that we have that our core, that our self-actualization, that our completion is dependent on a responsibility to perform a task, to play a role. And that this is deeply important to our actual healing and complete recovery. To begin to see our stories, to begin to see our clients' stories, to begin to see integration through this lens of personal responsibility and even morality. Morality just being that we have a responsibility. And if our drive is mainly towards finding meaning in our lives, that we need, that you can't have meaning without responsibility and without relationships. So I'm going to wind up here, and Alan Watts' quote, all of biology is delegation of authority. And Cytogenesis, Antonovsky argued to be studying the life force. And I had a light bulb moment, because when I was teaching this to interns, the circuit, what I talked about was the primitive brain, the reptilian brain is self-regulating. And then the limbic brain is when we begin to learn how to co-regulate, to cooperate. And then I had this light bulb go off, because I realized that from an evolutionary standpoint, if you can say evolution started with the first two atoms coming together to form a molecule, and then molecules coming together to form cells, and cells coming together to form organs, and organ systems coming together to form the whole organism. That reptile, that reptilian brain, the brainstem, is actually this monumental feat in cooperation. Cooperation between atoms and cells and organs. And then the brainstem, what it's doing is reading the environment for patterns, which means relationship. It is seeking to find relationship with its environment. What are the optimal conditions? And so this life force, it's about relationship. That really, the story of evolution is this force that brings things together. And it's about relationship. So a whole person approach, really quickly, it means supporting the entire person. The brainstem, physical regulation, trauma healing, teaching self-regulation skills, breath work, yoga, meditation, talking about lifestyle, daily practices, supporting our limbic system, our need for deep belonging through shared values and reciprocity. And then story, healing our story of the past and the present, practice teaching mindfulness so that we can be discerning about what is real and what is not, what is authentic, what brings us alive, so that we know what our core values are. And the only way to know that is through the body. And that's what mindfulness to me is really about, is to be aware of what is real. And to help people develop a vision for their future based on their authentic self and based on fulfilling their potential through action and service. And I'll end here with something that I'm trying to put together called the Integrative Health Alliance. So there's a training in how to assess and formulate a case and to treat people the way we do at Hope. So it's training in a whole person approach and the art of storytelling via an ecological lens. It's learning how to work in a multimodal team to achieve complete recovery. This approach, working at all these levels, happens when you work in a multimodal way. And our people, our clients are doing that already. They go to yoga, they go to meditation, they have a therapist, they have a psychiatrist. When you work in a team, you can actually support a real complete process, and people can completely recover again and get past this idea of chronic health conditions are the norm. The Integrative Health Alliance is a commitment to our own self-care and a whole person approach to promote our own integrity and our own power of discernment, which leads to our own gifts becoming uncovered. It's a commitment to supporting people's innate capacity to heal and complete recovery again through this ecological commitment. And if you're interested, you can send me an email at omid@lameda.org. And when I roll this out, I will keep you informed. And that's the last slide.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Wow. I learned a lot. I really feel like, especially with this pandemic driving us further and further into isolation, it really calls for this more integrative approach, this relational approach in community. And yeah, I really hope that modern medicine continues to follow this lead. So I do have a few questions, if you have a few minutes, and it looks like we have one as well here. So this looks like a beautiful comprehensive model. It is also, I assume, extremely time/labor intensive and thus very costly. How do we make this available to folks who do not have the means to access this?
Yeah, great question. So this is my cell when I work with people. I don't work with very people who can only pay high amounts, but most of the people I see are years into spending money, seeing a therapist, seeing a psychiatrist, being treated with a chronic health condition as if it's something they have to manage. And what I tell them is that if you buy into this whole person approach, and if you are ready to really change and really actually look at what this crisis is trying to teach you, most people are done within months. I'm rarely seeing somebody 6 months, a year later. So part of it is an investment if you are ready to really look at everything. So what I say is, you're ready to look at everything and really do the work. I know that most of the time, I believe you can get completely better. And so part of it is like putting things up front. I think that if cost is an issue, because most people in our team, they will see me, they will see a therapist who's using ketamine is what we use in our clinic, because that's what's legal. But we also will often we'll see a somatic therapist and maybe a life coach. But I think that most people can do all of this in their own therapy. If you understand the ecological approach, if you understand the whole person approach, most of it, the work is on the individual. The work is on the individual. So a lot of it is coming into a real contract. Like what I say to people is, if you're willing to do the work, I know that I can support you. So it's really about like the education and the skills that the person has to go out and do themselves.
Could you maybe speak a little bit about your trauma-informed integrative health model, in the sense of like somebody, I know you have an integrative assessment that you offer through your clinic.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about like what that would look like if someone wanted to connect with you?
Yeah, so one of the things for me that I really was disappointed in when I was trained was like all we were taught as psychiatrists to do was to give a diagnosis. But if you wanted to really understand your story, you're supposed to go to therapy. And to do that, you go and you sit and you do most of the talking. And every once in a while, the therapist says something. And this idea that like down the road, I'm going to understand everything, to me was like, I think there's a bias there. I mean, I remain a patient for years that way. So what I wanted to do was at the beginning, at the time of the assessment, to give people as best as possible a complete sense of what's happening. And how do you do that when everybody's story is so unique? But if you take an ecological lens, if you think of the individual in that basic way, like you do a house plant, like how much water, how much sun, and like our stories are also very simple. You know, if you go into people's story, there is trauma. There's then lifestyle decisions that we are using to cope. And that diagram I showed you guys about the authentic self holding in the body, what we do is we can actually map your story to that at the time of the assessment. So we go through all the past, your present behaviors, your present relationships. And within that hour and 15 minutes, we actually then share back your story using that diagram where I map everything that we found. So giving people at the outset a picture of what I'm experiencing in my body, what I'm experiencing in my lifestyle and behaviors and relationships, and how the past and the present are interrelated. And that's what this assessment that the training can teach you, is how to assess and put that together for a person at the beginning. And I think that when you do that, when a person sees their story on the whiteboard like that, it's that cytogenic model. It gives them that sense of coherence. It's understandable, it's manageable, and it's meaningful. Because the story is also about that authentic self-actualizing. You know, so then you can do the therapy in which a person can go into their unique, the components that are unique to them. But the story is not that complicated. You know, we hold, trauma and grief, we're holding it in. It may lead to adrenal fatigue in one person or a gut imbalance in another person. But those can be mapped to, this is what's happening in your body because of what you're holding in. One person has migraine headaches, another person develops an autoimmune disease. And you can map these. So what's important is seeing the relationship between these and to giving a person that coherent story at the outset.
Beautiful. It reminds me a lot of really just reactivating the agency of the patient in the healing process, which I feel like is so missing in a lot of Western medicine approach, where it's sort of like the answers are outside you, take this pharmaceutical,
right,
treat the symptoms, and what you're offering is really empowering to people, to
right,
remembering that we have this power and innate capacity to heal. And
right,
I feel like that's been so lost in
right.
our approach.
Everything we're doing is always telling a story. When a person comes into your office, they sit down, it's all an experience. There's a theater to it where you're learning, you're learning something. So when you go and a doctor spends 10 minutes and says, you have, take this medicine, what he's saying to you is there's something missing inside you. When we go to a sweat lodge, when we do these transformational experiences like a sweat lodge, the person running the sweat lodge, they're telling a story at the beginning. There's stories all along the way that you are placing yourself in. So the idea to me is that this assessment through an ecological lens, it's giving a therapist or a doctor an ability to think like a shaman does, to think about the way in which we're orchestrating the experience from the very beginning. Your storytelling. That's what I'm doing with a person. You're storytelling. And when you communicate that it's comprehensible, that it's manageable, and that it's meaningful, you're tapping into that art.
Amazing. And on that note, actually, and we have a couple questions, and this was something I wanted to ask as well, was how do you see psychedelics fitting into this approach? And Rowan also asks, how are these psychedelic compounds and therapies so effective in catalyzing a breaking down of the mental barriers and providing glimpses to one's true wholeness and authenticity? So if you can, maybe just speak a little about what you see for psychedelics fitting into this as we move forward.
So psychedelics, I think what they, when you look at the brain imaging and the research on what they all seem to do mostly is that they actually turn off parts the default mode network. They have different spirits and they bring in different things, but the main thing is I think that they turn off that part of the brain that creates the persona. Those fixed, rigid ideas we have that we develop in order to fit in. And so you get a window of time where that gets shut off. Ayahuasca brings its own spirit. Psilocybin brings its own spirit, but they're also, I think mainly they're bringing you into direct reality. I think they're opening the doorway to direct reality versus the illusion of our minds. And so you get this window of being able to piece together. And I think that when you get a story, like for me, with ayahuasca, I'm always learning where in my body I'm holding that information that needs to move, right? Yeah.
I think a huge part of it too, for me at least, has been a deeper understanding or embodied knowing of the interconnectedness of all things too. It's like kind of, for me, it kind of forces that ecological lens because you directly and intimately connect with things that are beyond yourself, essentially.
And for me, what I think like that, it's like I'm in the world of integrative medicine. I'm always thinking about integrating into mainstream thinking. Like that can be an esoteric idea, but really at a basic level, that's the truth. Is that we know that when you're a kid, you look at the world that way, not because it's woo-woo or a beautiful way of thinking. It's actually, you see that everything is interrelated. Right. So I think it's bringing you into that just direct reality. When you're a tribe of people living in the wild and survival is imminent, you're very aware of how dependent everything is on each other. That's what the brainstem is always doing, is looking for the patterns of relationship.
Totally agree. Thank you. I just wanted to ask maybe the last question, if we don't have any others. Do you have, how long have you been doing this sort of integrative approach? And do you have any success stories that you want to share just to kind of show it in action?
Yeah, I will. I have a client that I love to share her story. Let's just call her Mary. She was, she had suffered, she was in her 40s when I met her. She had been depressed and anxious for 20 years, had used so many medications, and she'd been hospitalized multiple times, actually, with suicidal thoughts. And she suffered a lot with panic attacks. And one thing I do with people is I said to her, rather than talking about the panic attack, call me when you're having one. And if I can, text me, and if I can call you and coach you through it. And she called me one day in a parking lot of a Walmart or whatever. And she said, I'm having a panic attack. And I coached her through it. And she never had a panic attack again. And when we processed it, what she realized was, the trauma for her as a child was her father had severe schizophrenia. And and his needs were very, very high. And so she learned to never ask for help. So just that acting of reaching out. However, her depression still did not get, her depression got a lot better, but it didn't get all the way better. And hope, we were always working on like her believing in life. It was like the moral injury of her father. Her father died very young, and he was really mistreated by society, and it left her very cynical about life. And she wasn't ready, like she was not enough to change for. And then her sister got pregnant, and her sister had a child, a young girl. And her experience seeing her father ill was so a part of her trauma. So then we began to talk about it, and I said, have you thought about your niece now is seeing you, the adult, like you saw your dad, where sees the world through your eyes. So she sees your depression. She sees your cynicism. Now, that can sound very moralistic, but if you are, working just empathically, it was stating just what was that like for her? Ultimately, she wasn't ready to change for herself. But when she realized the role she's playing in somebody else's life, she then began to make the lifestyle changes that were key to her completely changing and becoming whole again. Like she couldn't love herself enough. But when she saw the role she's playing, so to me, that's a good story, because it's a storytelling approach. It's like really understanding our needs to have purpose and meaning in our life. And that's what really drives us. I mean, there's a reason why we have so much self-help books, because we mostly don't actually change for ourselves. But when you feel like you have something meaningful that matters beyond you, that really is what activates that innate drive.
Going back to that sort of responsibility and relational core drivers.
Yeah.
Powerful. Amazing. Karen asked what are your thoughts on generational trauma and imprinting? Meaning, if your grandparent wasn't able to healthfully process the trauma, can that be passed on, or does the trauma need to be personally experienced?
No, definitely. Yeah. It imprints in your genes, even epigenetically. But definitely we sense and read the adults growing up, and we get imprinted by their behavior. We get imprinted by their beliefs. And those behaviors and beliefs are holding together unresolved trauma. And so we take that on. And then the more sensitive ones, they feel it even more deeply, and they pick up on those things.
I'll even, for an interesting peek into epigenetics, Karen, maybe check out Joe Tefor's work. He wrote The Fellowship of the River, and he talks a lot about that and how psychedelics can actually help to change or alter our epigenetic expression. And then that changed epigenetic can then be passed on to future generations in a more healed capacity. It's really fascinating research. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Naim, for sharing your amazing knowledge. I mean, it's so enlightening to understand the broader context for why we're feeling so disconnected and how it's really affecting us on all of these levels. And also that there's an opportunity for us to truly heal. So I really hope that the field of medicine can follow your lead, and that we can continue to build better bridges of understanding across these different fields. It's so needed right now.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Yeah. I want to share that Hope Psychiatry is listed as a practitioner partner inside the Maloka. So you can visit the network tab and click on practitioner partners. You'll see their profile. You can read more about their approach, check out their website, connect with them for an integrative assessment to help enact some of these principles into your life. So yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Naim. If you appreciated this event, we'll have many more for the public, as well as members only events and discounts if you sign up for our Maloka membership. So just want to share that. You can check it out in our memberships tab in themaloka.com. And also that our next event is a trauma-informed plant medicine masterclass hosted by the founders of Trauma and Somatics. This is on the 27th at 4 p.m. Central. and that you can check out under the events tab in themaloka.com. So thank you so much. Dr. Naim, is there anything else you'd like to share before we sign off?
No, just thanks so much. It was great to do it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all so much for attending. Really, really appreciated
Hi,
this
everyone.
beautiful evening. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone.